Molecular Freedom and Deleuzian Individualism. By Adam Fitchett. As discussed in a previous piece of mine on post-liberalism, I agree with the widespread and growing understanding that liberalism, and by extension liberal humanism, has failed. However, unlike many self-described post-liberals, I do not hope for liberalism to be replaced by some kind of conservative or reactionary ideology. Instead, I want to formulate a position which retains the spirit of liberalism, while transcending the bounds of a naive liberal humanism. I am convinced that the path towards such a meta-liberalism runs through the work of the philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, as well as two of their most prominent disciples, viz. Manuel Delanda and Nick Land. More specifically, I believe that the Deleuzo-Guattarian concept of molecular freedom, developed to its most radical extent by Nick Land, has an important place in such a meta-liberalism. My detailed objections to humanism and liberalism are beyond the scope of this piece, although some of the major consequences of failing to transcend a naive humanism will be highlighted here. Mainly, however, this piece will focus on what happens to a key aspect of liberalism, viz. Individualism, when it is pushed beyond the horizon of its current humanist framework and in a more Deleuzian direction. Molar versus molecular individualism. Individualism is an ideological position which privileges the individual over the collective. In nearly all forms of individualism to date, the word individual has been taken to refer specifically to an adult, mentally sound individual of the species Homo sapiens. Thus, the boundaries of the individual are at the skin. No more and no less than what is contained within my skin constitutes me as an individual. The myriad reasonable objections to drawing such a strict line in such a place will not be enumerated here. Suffices to say, however, that Deleuze and Guattari, hereafter D and G, would especially object to the molar nature of this concept of the individual. D and G's dichotomy between the molar and the molecular will help us in transcending this inadequate understanding of what an individual is. Roughly, by molar versus molecular we mean considering something as a unified, separate and indivisible whole versus viewing it as a set of interrelated components with a potentially fluid boundary. While the molar perspective leads to what Delanda calls reified generalities, such as the individual or society, the molecular perspective produces a much more nuanced understanding that is more compatible with a materialist ontology. For Delanda, it is wrong to adopt a dualistic social ontology in which the individual is opposed to the collective, or society. Instead of considering the social at only these two levels, Delanda sees the social realm as consisting of many layers of aggregates he calls assemblages. Assemblages do not have an essential nature, but are instead differentiated and identified by their particular genesis, history, parts and relations. In this view, it does indeed make sense to oppose the individual person to the collective, where perhaps the collective is some larger aggregate of individuals. But it also makes sense to oppose the individual cell to the collective, that is the body. The individual city to the collective of cities, the individual nation to the collective of nations, the individual atom to the collective that is the molecule, and so on. The molecular understanding of the individual versus the collective sees this binary as relative rather than absolute. Since it deprivileges the one particular kind of individual that is contained by a bag of skin, the individualism that aligns with it must construct an understanding of individual freedom that operates at all levels of the social, rather than simply at the level of bags of skin. Individual freedom versus libidonal freedom. What is the spirit of liberalism that I wish to retain while disposing with much of its content and foundations? The classic dichotomy of liberalism versus conservatism, summed up iconically in the differing reactions of Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke to the French Revolution, is a pessimistic versus optimistic view of human nature. Stereotypically, a conservative believes that human beings are naturally fallen, evil, rapacious, selfish beings that need to be disciplined by authority into becoming well-behaved civilized individuals. Give people too much freedom and they will go wild, unleash their inner satanic nature and start raping, killing and devouring one another left and right. Liberals on the other hand believe that humans are fundamentally good-hearted. Give people freedom and, for the most part, they will treat one another well, and spontaneously organize into a civilized society without the need for powerful authority figures to direct them from the top down. For neoliberals, this is often moderated into the position that people are fundamentally mixed, but will behave well if the right legal framework and decentralized incentive structures, like market forces, are in place. Since meta-liberals are post-humanists, we reject the idea of an essential human nature, and hence assert that human beings are not essentially anything. In our framework, the Paine-Burke opposition is not about human nature but about desire. While conservatives are highly suspicious of desire, liberals are much more comfortable with it. The spirit of liberalism, and meta-liberalism, is libidonal freedom. We should clarify that desire here is not an individuated desire, but a depersonalized desire that is expressed through us rather than just by us. Pace D and G. We are desiring machines animated by a machinic unconscious. Thus libidinal liberation is not just freedom for us to do whatever we want but freedom for desire, and in many cases desires freedom from us. This is one major reason why the molar conception of individual freedom is inadequate. Consequences of molecular individualism. Individualism typically considers and judges the set of relations that prevail between the individual and the collective. Specifically, individualism looks askance at social structures in which the individual is subjugated by the collective. Individualists want individuals to be free, which means they should be free from constraint and coercion by the collective, and most importantly the state. Given our new molecular understanding of individualism, however, this focus on freeing individual humans from the collective is too narrow. In order for desire to be free, individuals at all levels should be free from the tyranny of collectives at all levels. Our focus should be on the internal relations that prevail in any given collective, and whether those relations provide scope for desire to realize itself through the individuals in that collective. This perspective patches a large blind spot in liberal and libertarian philosophy with respect to tyranny that is not specifically state tyranny. While liberals are obsessed with freedom from state despotism, they often ignore despotism in the private sphere, such as in the family, community or workplace, at the supranational level, and crucially also at the sub-individual level. This concern for liberating desire at the sub-individual level is especially important for a Deleuzo-Guattarian metaliberalism. We tyrannize ourselves when we internalize mechanisms of libidinal repression. Modern liberal regimes, while they are less starkly despotic than more explicitly authoritarian regimes, effect a more subtle program of control via personal responsibility, in which individual humans are made responsible for becoming their own despot. We will not be truly free until we are free from domination by the superego. Molecular liberation. If freedom beyond humanism is no longer thought of in terms of inalienable rights and their violation, then how is it thought of? Here more of D and G's terminology becomes of use to us. Their concepts of stratification, coding and territorialization allow us to evaluate how much freedom a given collective grants to the individuals within it. In a social context, territorialization refers to the degree to which some collective has rigid boundaries, i.e. how difficult it is to enter or exit. Stratification refers to how rigidly segmented and hierarchical it is, i.e. whether it is a collective with a flat, egalitarian structure, or one in which there is strict division between an elite and a subjugated class. Finally, coding refers to the extent to which a collective is governed by explicit written rules, a code, rather than by informal norms and automatic processes. Under this understanding of liberation then, individuals become more liberated when they are, more easily able to enter into and exit from relations with other individuals and collectives, 2, less subject to domination by higher levels of some rigid, hierarchical system of control, and 3, less subject to formal rules and regulations. Governance compatible with individual freedom is thus greatly informal, decentralized and non-possessive. Since desire, by D&G's reckoning, is fundamentally a creative and productive phenomenon. Another very important aspect of a meta-liberal political regime is that it must give as much free rein as possible to exit. Rather than attempting to uniformize individuals, to make them think and desire and behave as similarly as possible, meta-liberalism encourages divergence. Not the superficial pseudo-divergence of the diversity preached by contemporary liberalism, but real divergence. Freedom is freedom to be different. Here meta-liberalism addresses a fundamental bigotry on the part of traditional liberalism. While liberalism's claim that all humans have the same rights on account of their common humanity may seem fluffy and wonderful, it leaves wide open the question of who is to be counted as human and who is not, as well as implying that similarity is the sole basis for freedom. Hence, if two individuals are indeed fundamentally different, then liberalism does not, at least doctrinally, respect this difference, but instead attempts to ignore it or explain it away. At worst, the consistent liberal is forced to deny rights to any individual deemed non-human, a situation which has slowed the extension of compassion and respect to animals, as well as assisting the maintenance of institutions such as slavery and segregation. Disputes and exit. How radical should we be in our call for molecular freedom? If there is a conflict between the freedom of individuals at a more macroscopic and at a more microscopic level, should the dispute be resolved downwards or upwards? The individualist inclination is to always resolve conflicts downwards, but this very quickly leads to absurdities such as, for example, an individual person not being allowed to get chemotherapy since they should defer to the freedom of their cancer cells. Consider Nick Land, whose late 90s stance can be seen as a call for matter itself to be liberated from all constraints, in a great ecstatic alignment with the second law of thermodynamics. While delightfully radical in theory, the ultimate consequences of dissolving all constraints seem troubling. Should no dissipatory desires of any kind be impeded at all? Should anyone, or indeed anything, be allowed to do anything, so long as it promotes an increase in entropy? For early Land, the process of deterritorialization that drives the evisceration of all material constraints is an inevitable one, although later Land does admit that the process can be impeded at least temporarily by politics. How, if at all, would meta-liberals want politics to impede that process? We could posit that disputes should be resolved downwards in all situations excepting those where doing so would risk the very existence of the collective, provided that the overall amount of individual freedom within the collective is increased by resolving upwards. This, however, is bound to throw up a litany of problematic exceptions. It may be that there is no tidy solution to this conundrum, and that situations in which conflicts can't easily be resolved must be decided at the discretion of the parties involved. There is, however, another major solution, at least at a more macroscopic level, resolving the disputes sideways through exit. If the metapolitical architecture is designed in such a way as to promote a diversity of regimes, experimentation within those regimes, competition between them and ease of movement through them, then concerns about internal conflict are greatly alleviated. Individuals who take issue with the way things are run in a given collective can simply take their leave. Prospects for Deleuzian individualism. Where does this Deleuzo-Guattarian individualism sit within the current political landscape, and what are its prospects for success? I've written before about how I see meta-liberalism as an obvious counterforce to post-liberalism. But that force is likely to be manifested in the form of a neo-neoliberalism that is considerably less radical than a consistent meta-liberalism would call for. At the fringes of the political spectrum, where all interesting new political ideas emerge, friends for meta-liberalism seem scarce. While the radical, Marxist, left has exhibited a laudatory understanding of liberalism's inadequacies for a long while, this is very much counterbalanced by its complete failure to produce any political regimes that actually net increase the amount of individual freedom for anyone. The radical right occasionally glimmers with signs of something promising, but it is always buried within a steaming pile of reactionary nonsense. The most promising developments in radical political theory today are various kinds of post-libertarianism, including Nickland's accelerationism, and particularly the unconditional variant, U-ac, that appeared in the Weird Theory blogosphere around 2017. U-ac encourages us to lean hard into the accelerating process of deterritorialization that characterizes modern capitalism, while U/its focus on giving into the intoxicating possession of bodies by technocapital may align well with the spirit of meta-liberalism. It may not always deliver results that would be favorable to a Deleuzian individualist. While we delight in letting our id out of the box, we should also take care to remain vigilant, and remember what Foucault has taught us: every power necessarily meets a resistance.